Back when the game first launched, I remember how all the lore that we had was pointing towards Rhinedottir being the sinner, like the only person responsible for the khaenri'ah cataclysm and the whole mess that followed. And now we have 5 of her. 5 sinners who appear to be responsible for the events of the cataclysm. Or at least 5 people responsible for not stopping an existing cataclysm. So today I want to talk about these guys because I have a surprising amount to say and speculate about, and I think you guys will find it very interesting. Because apparently Apollo hit me in the face with a dodgeball a couple of years ago. Now as always, timestamps, spoiler warning, citations, attributions, and links to related content will be in the description box, while post-video notes and corrections can always be found in the pinned comment. Now then, let's hop aboard this crazy train and take a trip to Sin City. So let's talk about this dodgeball that hit me. Back in 2021, I made a theory about domains, and I tried to argue that the reason that there were 5 rings above every petrified tree was because there were 5 abyssal archons. Because see, in the Gnostic book, the Apocrypha of John, the Demiurge is said to have created 12 total archons, 7 to rule the heavens and 5 to rule the abyss. The 7 heavenly archons are easy to spot, because they're labeled as archons, and we've met them. But the 5 abyssal ones eluded me, so at the time I thought they might be the dead archons since 5 of the original heavenly archons perished, but it turns out they were the sinners the whole time. A perfect example of right answer, wrong math. The sinners are Rhinedottir, Vedrfolnir, Rerir, Surtalogi, and Hroptatyr, all names with ties to Norse mythology, which is fitting given that they're all khaenri'ah, and that seems to be the khaenri'ah's primary inspiration. Dane says that he and the sinners were once tasked with stopping the Vinster King from continuing to rock the foundations of the world. It seems as though leaving the king unchecked would have brought about a great disaster. But the 5 sinners couldn't resist the allure of the abyss and divided amongst themselves a power that could destroy the world, transcending their humanity in the process. Dane didn't participate in whatever they did, and he was unable to stop the impending cataclysm on his own, which is likely what the Abyss Twin was referring to when they said Dane failed to protect the people of khaenri'ah during the We Will Be Reunited questline. Now, you remember how I called those sinners the Abyssal Archons? I know they're not actually called that in-game, but I'm gonna roll with the idea, so stick with me. So each of the 7 heavenly archons have a gnosis, and the gnoses are the remains of the 3rd descender, one of the most powerful types of life forms found in Teyvat. But if Hoyo is going the 12 archon route with 5 in the abyss, then it's reasonable to assume that they possess their own type of gnosis. Now I believe this is the world-shattering power that they divided between themselves that Dane mentions. And since gnoses are the remains of a dead deity, it would be reasonable to assume that the abyssal variety came from the remains of a deity as well, most likely the Vinster King. Now, there are quite a few candidates for the identity of the Vinster King, but there's one in particular that I think makes the most sense based only on the information that we currently have. And that candidate is Nibelung, the Dragon King. Here's my logic. In Norse mythology, there's an enormous serpent named Nidhogg that lives beneath the roots of the world tree and gnaws away at these roots with the intent to topple the entire thing, which is bad because the world tree kind of holds the whole world together, and if it falls, it marks the end of the world. That's why the arrival of Nidhogg on the surface heralds the beginning of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the apocalypse at the end of the world. So with that in mind, Kari Bear tells us the purpose of the Loom of Fate is to weave new ley lines, but the thing is, ley lines as they exist right now are the roots of Irminsul. Now, if we assume that Irminsul is a completed Loom of Fate that's operated by Celestia, something I made a case for in this video, and Irminsul is also the world tree, then a Loom of Fate is basically just a seed that will eventually grow into a world tree that controls fate by, weaving the ley lines. This is why a Loom of Fate can only make new ley lines and not extend or alter existing ones. Trees only really have control over their own root systems. But if Irminsul is Celestia's Loom of Fate, and fate is the system by which Celestia controls the world according to Nouvelette's character stories, then who would detest this system more than the original ruler of the world, the Dragon King Nibelung? And that would make Nibelung Nidhogg. And I find this idea rather compelling. See, Nouvelette calls Nibelung the Heavenly Father in his voice lines, so in my video on Spirit Veins, I made the case for Nibelung to be a Shenlong, or rather, a heavenly dragon. Now, Shenlongs don't really exist in Norse mythology because they're Chinese, but Norse mythology does have dragons known as lindworms, and Nidhogg is the most prominent of all the lindworms. And the best part is that lindworms seem to resemble Chinese dragons like Shenlongs quite a bit, like in physical representations. Both are long, serpentine, and frequently depicted without wings, yet are still able to fly. Makes for really good cultural overlap. And thanks to a pep, we also know that at some point during the war between the dragons and Celestia, that Nibelung left to retrieve forbidden knowledge from the depths of the abyss. So associating him with Vinster, which means darkness, makes sense because dark powers are generally associated with the abyss, and rocking the foundations of the world, as Dane describes it, certainly sounds a lot like Irminsul getting its roots a bit ruffled. Also, as a fun little etymological side note, the German word Nebelfinster is a compound noun made up of the words Nebel for fog and Vinster for dark, so dark fog. The word Nibelung also seems to have a similar etymology, with Nibel also coming from fog, and Lung likely coming from Lungo, which means light. His name is Light Fog. Pretty fitting if he's a light dragon from heaven, which means we have Nebelfinster for dark fog and Nibelung for light fog, and both are kings, and boy do I love me some pun impact. Actually, this kind of reminds me of how Azhdaha was also sealed beneath a tree, just like Nidhogg. As the seal weakened, he even lured several miners towards the location of his seal in an effort to break it, kind of like the Vinster King in The Sinners. Azhdaha even had two versions of himself, a light version in Kunjun and a dark version in Jiu. Would that make Zhongli an allegorical primordial one in this case? Like, he is a representative of Celestia, after all. Smells a bit like foreshadowing to me. It's also worth pointing out that the Dragon Queller tree that Azhdaha is sealed under has started to fuse with him, so the tree is now literally his tail, which also means we might have been fighting him in his realm of consciousness, which I find interesting given how we interacted with Kari'ah inside of his own realm of consciousness. And if this really is allegorical foreshadowing for the Dragon King being trapped beneath the world tree, then it might be possible that he was also starting to merge with Irminsul. I know that seems unlikely since he would be full of things like forbidden knowledge and other things that Irminsul is really sensitive to, and the last time it got infected with that kind of stuff, Rukkhadevata just had to delete herself in order to fix it. But it's also worth pointing out that the roots of Irminsul go all the way into the depths of the abyss, so I think it's pretty possible. And there's one more thing that makes me think the Vinster King is Nibelung, or rather, Nibelvinster. Nidhogg coils around the world tree's roots, while an eagle named Hresvelgr lives in the top branches. Now, for the record, Celestia is almost exclusively associated with birds when it comes to animal imagery, so you probably know where this is going. There's this other character, a squirrel called Ratatoskr, who runs up and down the tree carrying messages between Nidhogg and Hresvelgr, and the name Ratatoskr literally means traveler. And sure, okay, Celestia's asleep right now, so the traveler can't exactly give them any messages, unless Paimon is like their voicemail system. But it's not like they're giving any information to the Dragon King directly, although the Abyss Twin might. Because, if the Sinners are affiliated with the Vinster King, even if it's just a loose connection, and the Abyss Twin is associated with the Abyss Order, which was inspired by one of the Sinners, then perhaps the Abyss Twin is the other half of Ratatoskr, the one who relays messages to Nidhogg. And reporting to the Vinster King would explain why the Abyss Twin is called the Prince or Princess. I'm just saying. Now that might be all I have to say about the Vinster King for now, but we are nowhere near being close to done with all of this stupid mess of Norse mythology. Now we have to take a closer look at the Sinners themselves. And we're most familiar with Rhinedottir, so let's start with her. Rhinedottir is Albeto's master and mother, an alchemical genius and a member of the Hexenzirkel. Her name comes from the famous opera by Wagner, Nibelungenlied, which is also what the Dragon King Nibelung is likely named after. In the first act of this opera, there are three maidens who live in the Rhine River, protecting their father's gold. Their father is the god of the Rhine River, so he is the Rhine Father. Rhinedottir is named after these Rhine maidens. Her name literally means daughter of the River Rhine. And fun fact, the Rhine River region is where rhinestones were invented. They were made of glass and treated in a unique way to make them resemble real stones, which is why Albedo likens his own creation to the process of glass blowing during the Shadows Amid Snowstorm event. Because he was a synthetic test tube baby, a homunculus. So if humans are real gemstones, then he considers himself a rhinestone, something like an imitation. Rhinedottir also goes by the title Gold, and is an extremely skilled alchemist responsible for creating several fell dragons, Elenus and Durin, as well as Albedo and allegedly the Rift Wolves. Her creations were why so many of the effects of the Cataclysm were attributed to her. And as I've already mentioned, she's a prominent member of the Hexenzirkel, which is why I'm not going to talk about her much more than this, because the Imaginarium Theater, which is also coming out later this patch, is Hexenzirkel themed. And I imagine that we're going to get more information on her there, so I'd like to, postpone this analysis for later. Moving on. Surtalogi is a fellow we're fairly familiar with. He's the master of Skirk, and by association, the master of Child, since the power of the foul legacy comes from him. Now, in a recent video, I pointed out that his name comes from the fires of Surtur, and Surtur's most prominent role in mythology is as the harbinger of Ragnarok, the Nordic version of the apocalypse at the end of the world. Surtur's arrival in the battlefield is preceded by a seemingly endless winter called Fimbulvetr, and I think Fimbulvetr might be what the Fatui's Project Stuja is based on, since Stuja means extreme cold, and the project also involves Child. So by proxy, this whole Project Stuja thing could very well get Surtalogi involved, and therefore trigger Ragnarok. Also worth pointing out that there are quite a few visual similarities between Child's foul legacy and the Abysslings. This was always a bit confusing to me, but now it makes sense. Surtalogi is a sinner with abyssal powers, which probably grants him a more powerful transformation ability. So if Child is this powerful with the foul legacy, then imagine what Surtalogi can do. I think Rerir has been done a great disservice in the localization. In English, their title is Rerir of Solnari, which just means like Avenger of Solnari. But the Chinese is way more straightforward. It's just Moon Hunter. A title like this immediately makes you think of, hunting moons or people affiliated with the moons. Like, I don't know, people from the Crimson Moon Dynasty. Theoretically speaking, Rerir should be from the Eclipse Dynasty, and they don't like the Crimson Moon Dynasty. And because this title is affiliated with him specifically, I wonder if the moon that he hunted was of great importance, like the king of the Crimson Moon Dynasty. I don't have a real solid basis for this theory, but Rerir is named after a figure from the Volsunga saga, and in that story, Rerir successfully gets their revenge for their own father's murder. Now, if we assume that a moon killed Rerir's father, or like someone from the Crimson Moon Dynasty did, then having them be called the Moon Hunter makes a lot of sense to me, especially if the person responsible for their father's murder was a person of very high standing, like I said before, like a king or a knight, I don't know. So if the Chinese is so straightforward, why then did they choose Rerir of Solnari? Solnari could come from a word like solunar, which means sun and moon, but it could also be a compound noun where Sol is sun and Nari is like an alternate form for Narfi, who was killed and later had his entrails used to bind his father Loki. So if that's the case, then Rerir would be the son of Narfi and the grandson of Loki, both of whom belong to the Eclipse or the Black Sun Dynasty, because that is actually another name for the Eclipse Dynasty, Black Sun. For those of you who don't know, the dynasties of khaenri'ah are actually named by real celestial bodies that are down there. Their moon is a crimson moon, and their sun is a black or dark sun. But anyway, to make things more confusing, Narfi is also the name of the father of the personification of night, which might make Rerir's title more like Avenger of the Night Sun, or again, the Dark Sun. So while the Chinese player base got a very straightforward title in Moon Hunter, we got the opposite of Sun Avenger. It is the same meaning, but it's quite a trip to get there. That said, there might be another reason why they chose Avenger of Solnari. It could be a very heavily veiled Fischl reference. After all, Fischl's full name is Fischl von Luftschloss Narfidort, also known as Fischl of the Sky Castle Narfidort, wherein Narfidort could refer to descendants of Narfi or Nari, and I'm basing that on the fact that in Chinese, the Dort of Narfidort is the same as the one used for daughter in Rhinedottir. Fischl is also very likely to be Khaenri'ah, but I don't really want to get into that right now, so I'm gonna link some theories down below in the description if you want to learn more about it. But besides that, Fischl is also called the Prinzessin der Verurteilung, and Princess Sin? That's a pun my buddy Schwan discovered. And Fischl's first name, Fischl, might be a reference to the Fisher King from Arthurian legend. Now, he was also called the Sinner King because the French word for fish and sinner were homonyms. And considering we're talking about 5 abyssal sinners here, it fits pretty well. Honestly, the more I look at this, the more Fischl references I find, so I'm gonna stop. Vedrfolnir fascinates me in the context of our previous discussion about Nibelung, Ratatoskr, and Hresvelgr, because in Norse mythology, Vedrfolnir is a falcon that sits atop Hresvelgr's head, which is a very funny mental image if you think of Hresvelgr as Celestia. But what it probably means is that Vedrfolnir is the Sinner Quintet's eye in the sky, which is totally on point because he's a visionary, someone who's capable of seeing the prophecies that affect the entire world. So basically, he can see what Celestia sees, the fate of the world itself, hence his metaphorical position atop its head. He's also Dane's brother, which I was not expecting. Now in Norse mythology, Vedrfolnir is often thought to go by a different name, Vedrfolnir, a golden rooster that's found in the branches of the World Tree, sometimes perched atop Hroptatyr head, so you can see why the scholars would think they were the same thing. Now according to Fjolsvinnsmal, Vedrfolnir brings a great deal of trouble to Surtur and Sinmara. Surtur is obviously supposed to be Surtalogi, but I don't quite know who Sinmara is supposed to be in the context of Genshin. I think it's relevant though because Sinmara is the keeper of the only sword that can kill Vedrfolnir. But what amuses me about this is that the name Vedrfolnir means wind-bleached or pale storm, while Vedrfolnir means, according to Bellows at least, tree snake. And this tree snake bird can only be killed by a very particular sword that's owned by Sinmara. Interesting then that this guy's brother, Daneslif, is named after a sword that can only be sheathed after it kills its target, and that Dane's constellation is Snake Ring, while his title is Bough Keeper, like in the branches of a tree. And also that Dane wants revenge against his brother. So if Sinmara is the keeper of the only sword that can kill Vedrfolnir, and Dane is a sword, does that mean that Sinmara is their mother? Food for thought. Anyway, Vedrfolnir's voice was the one that we heard when we saw the giant crystal in the chasm, which I think kind of threw some people for a loop because many people, myself included, theorized that this crystal might have been Deshret or Ermin, but that was also over a year ago and we've learned a lot since then. And before anybody asks, no, I am not upset that this crystal has seemingly no connection to Deshret. I'm actually kind of excited about the implications behind the similarity, and at the moment, I have two theories about it. The first is the most reasonable and the most likely. Both Deshret and Vedrfolnir were sealed using the same or similar methods. Deshret was full of forbidden knowledge that no one could seem to dispose of safely, which meant that he needed to be forcibly contained instead. The sinners, on the other hand, obtained a world-shattering power from a dark king, which could very possibly be forbidden knowledge or something similar to it, especially since Daneslif suggests it came from the abyss. I think that's a pretty fair and reasonable explanation, but it would be very unlike me to just leave it at that. You come here for conspiracy theories and tinfoil hat nonsense. So here's theory number 2. The other, less likely possibility is that this crystal is Deshret, but the explanation is full on crack, so again, fair warning. The idea came from a discussion I was having with my buddies Crystal Marie and Schwan, and it's more entertaining than plausible, but again, I just want to share it. Okay, so in the book Heart's Desire, the shopkeeper tells the story of the crystal heart, and it's essentially crystallized emotions left behind by an adeptus after they die. And for the purposes of this theory, I'm going to extend the idea to include gods as well, because this is a Liyue book, and so Liyue would mostly just talk about adepti. Now, later in the book, we learn that you can actually peer into these illuminating crystals, and you can see all manner of visions, kind of like a scry glass or a crystal ball. That sounds like the perfect feature for someone like a visionary. And then towards the end of the book, the shopkeeper actually speaks directly to the stone itself, which suggests that the stone is still somewhat conscious, or at least aware of what's going on around it. So the idea is this. This crystal is Deshret's crystal heart, but it's Vedrfolnir that's speaking to us through it. It's kind of like how Nicole never shows up in person, but instead manifests only when a certain type of teacup appears as a disembodied voice from the sky. Do you really think Nicole is the teacup? No. And I think the same logic might be able to be applied to Vedrfolnir. He might not be the crystal. The crystal just might be his teacup. This just might be how visionaries operate. I'm gonna go out a little bit farther on this limb. Assuming that Vedrfolnir is Vedrfolnir and is a golden rooster that sits atop the head of a great eagle, and scholars theorize that Vedrfolnir represents the eagle's wisdom in some way, and we look at the crystal in the chasm as the remains of Deshret that Vedrfolnir is peering through a la Heart's Desire, well, the name of the eagle is Hresvelgr, which means corpse swallower, and he's suggested to guard the gates of hell. And Deshret was the god of the sky and the god of the dead, having much in common with the Egyptian Osiris, which feels rather thematic. Maybe more so to me though, because I think Deshret was actually the heir to the throne of Celestia, but that's a theory for another time. I've had a year to study this Scarlet King, and I'm gonna make the wildest theory I can. So yeah, like I said, pretty improbable, kinda crack, but still really fun to think about. Okay, so our last sinner is Hroptatyr, whose name can either mean the sage or the crying god. It's one of the many kennings for the Norse god Odin, which might confuse some of you since Ermin is also considered a kenning for Odin, and Ermin is already a character in Genshin. So you might be wondering, which one is actually Odin? Or are they both Odin? Does that mean Hroptatyr is King Ermin? I don't think so. See, we've just been assuming that Ermin was supposed to represent Odin, when it's equally likely that Ermin could have been another god named Tyr. Now, many scholars believe that the epithet for Ermin originally belonged to Tyr but was later associated with Odin instead. Regardless of the claim's real-world veracity, I think this is the route that Hoyo is taking. Here's the logic. Ermin and Irminsul share a name, so we could assume that Irminsul is Ermin's tree, in the same way we assume that Yggdrasil means Odin's tree, since Ygr is another one of Odin's names. However, this Futhark rune is also called Tyr and is commonly identified with the god of the same name. The rune itself represents a spear, which is very fitting since, according to the legend of the Shattered Halberd, Ermin was the name of the first divine halberd that pierced the Axis Mundi and connected the 9 realms. So Tyr is a spear and a spear is a halberd. But the best part of this idea is that if you lay 3 Tyr runes on top of each other, they form a tree, an Irminsul, and this bind rune is thought to be used to invoke the god Tyr himself. And since the world tree is the axis the world revolves around, that makes the world tree the Axis Mundi. If Ermin was the lance that pierced the tree, then it makes sense to call it Irminsul. And if you combine this idea with some comments from Piero, things get a little more interesting. See, Piero was a royal mage of khaenri'ah, and he had beef with a bunch of sages who advised King Ermin. At least, that's what he says in the Mocking Mask. To quote, "Since my level of learning could not compare with the sages, I failed to earn the favor of the previous ruler." He also comments on these sages in a mocking manner in the Winter Night's Lasso trailer. But the thing is, both instances of the word sages in Chinese aren't explicitly plural. They're actually singular, and while the Chinese language isn't too strict about plurality, I think this might matter because the name Hroptatyr literally means sage, singular. So I think it's quite possible that this entire time Piero has been talking about one guy specifically, a single sage. He's not talking about a group of individuals, he's talking about Hroptatyr. So my hypothesis is that Piero and Hroptatyr were both advisors to King Ermin, but Piero couldn't compare to Hroptatyr, so Ermin follows Hroptatyr's advice instead of Piero's, which probably led to everything going horribly, horribly wrong because Hroptatyr ended up becoming a sinner full of abyssal power, and potentially causing, if not just failing to prevent, the cataclysm that followed. Which is probably why Piero now mocks him and calls himself a fool as a satirical nod to the foolishness of the so-called sage. If a sage's wisdom leads to disaster, then a fool's wisdom must lead to success, or something. I also think that Hroptatyr was a sage that hung from Irminsul as described in the Silver Twig. This sage gained knowledge of runes, and after this, the kingdom built along Irminsul's roots was able to catch a glimpse of the secrets from beyond the sky. The kingdom here should be khaenri'ah, and we have multiple mentions of khaenri'ah having caught a glimpse of what's beyond the firmament. I'm betting that Hroptatyr was the one responsible for obtaining this knowledge and proposing what to do with it, or at least he was heavily involved. And then in Paraneri, we have mention of the sages again, and this time it's referring to one of several sages, but it could still be referring to Hroptatyr, telling the king a story about beings that come from beyond the sky, because that's pretty on theme with everything else we know about him so far. But the king in this story is like, I don't get it, do whatever you want, which falls in line with what I've been saying, that it actually feels like the sage Hroptatyr is tricking or manipulating King Ermin. And that's why I don't think Hroptatyr and Ermin are the same person, even though both names are considered kennings for the same god. I think Ermin is supposed to reference Tyr, and Hroptatyr was supposed to reference Odin. Now, all that said, I must recognize that Ermin is described as having only one eye, just like Odin, in Kaya's letter from the Hidden Strife event, which would suggest that he is more Odin-like than I've been arguing for. But then again, Fortis Alberich, the man who would become the regent ruler in place of Ermin during the Cataclysm, also lost his left eye. And besides that, both Piero and Dainsleif have ties to the royal family, and they both cover their right eyes, so this might not be a feature unique to Ermin at all. Possessing only one eye or covering a single eye might be a symbol of status, wisdom, or rank in khaenri'ah. So calling someone one-eyed might be like calling someone blue blood to refer to them as noble. And it would also explain why people like Clothar, Halfdan, and Caribert don't have this. Besides, I still don't think that the effigies carried by the Abyss Order are of Ermin anymore, because Ermin seems to be merely complicit in the events of the Cataclysm, and the statuettes seem to imply a more active role for their representative. Just take a look at this line that reads, "See, my child, all that lies under the throne of heaven shall be destroyed by upheaval. The eternal peace of the pitch-dark void shall embrace us all." These just sound more like the words of an evil mastermind to me, and not of someone who's simply been convinced to participate in a premeditated plan. The Laughing Man has a really cool alternate take on Hroptatyr and Ermin though, so do check out his video later. Link in the description. But as a side note, I've also been wondering if Hroptatyr isn't Kaya's father. This is a wild and somewhat baseless speculation, but hear me out. First off, in Kaya's secret letter from the Hidden Strife event, his father says, "Remember always that it was the Alberich clan who did not have royal blood who stepped in as regents when the strength of the one-eyed king Ermin failed. Though we could not restore khaenri'ah to life, we of the Alberich clan should lead lives as those who blaze like fire rather than those who wallow in the embers." Which again have the same kind of vibe as the lines from the Dark Statuettes of the Abyss Order, albeit a little less unhinged. It's like Kaya's father had expectations of King Ermin that weren't met, which would be very fitting for Hroptatyr if he truly was trying to manipulate the king like I've been theorizing. It also establishes that the Alberichs wanted to restore khaenri'ah, which is likely what Caribear's Loom of Fate is intended to accomplish. After all, the Abyss Order wishes to restore the homeland, right? And they're responsible for making him into the Loom of Fate. Alberich is Kaya's last name, and it's also the name of the dwarf from the opera Nibelungenlied that becomes king of the Nibelung after seizing the Rhinegold and turning it into a cursed ring. If Hroptatyr is an Alberich, then the gold seized would be the world-shattering power or something similar that I mentioned earlier. Ironically, though, Dainsleif was actually found during the Cataclysm clutching a ring, and in the opera, Odin spends most of his time searching for or trying to seize the ring from other people. So that could actually be a potential plotline. But in Genshin, Anfortis Alberich actually became the regent ruler after King Ermin was rendered unable to govern during the Cataclysm. What's funny is that Anfortis is the real name of the Fisher King or Sinner King from the Arthurian legend that I talked about earlier, and a regent is pretty close to a king. Now, Anfortis must be related in some way to Clothar since they're both Alberichs, and Clothar founded the Abyss Order. And the Abyss Order was inspired by Vedrfolnir, who is a sinner just like Hroptatyr, who is named after Odin, and Odin was the one-eyed bearded god sometimes depicted with horns on his helmet, and an effigy resembling Odin is carried by higher-ranked Abyss Order members. And as previously hypothesized, Hroptatyr was most likely a member of the royal court alongside Piero. You with me so far? Good. Now, Kaya has a lot of raven or crow symbolism, from his references to the fable The Bird and Borrowed Feathers, to his network of treasure hoarders who bear the raven insignia, to his name which may be derived from a Norwegian word for jackdaw, Kaya, and also his dark blue coloring. It's not exactly befitting of a peacock, like the one in his constellation, which is also one-eyed, by the way. Plus, he has self-proclaimed linguistic powers, which seems to let him speak Hilichurlian, and he's been theorized to be conspiring with the Abyss Order ever since the first Archon quest when he went missing during an Abyss Order invasion. I mean, Kaya even knows that the sinners are all that's left of khaenri'ah. Now, Odin has two faithful raven companions, Hugin and Mugen, Thought and Memory, and every day these ravens fly into the world and collect information which they then relay back to Odin, adding to his wisdom. So my thought process is that the Alberich family are the ravens of Hroptatyr, or perhaps Hroptatyr was an Alberich himself, like I mentioned earlier. Perhaps he was the eldest and should have become regent instead of Anfortis, but he was too busy doing sinner things to take over. And if he is an Alberich, then he could be Kaya's father. After all, Kaya says he inherited his eye patch. If Hroptatyr is one-eyed, then this could be a reference to him. Plus, there's this one birthday art of Kaya that's suspiciously like this portrait of Odin. It certainly seems plausible. But there's another idea that scratches my brain. When Kaya's father left him at the Dawn Winery, he told Kaya that he was the last hope for khaenri'ah and then vanished. But given the sheer number of similarities that people from all over the internet have been pointing out between Kaya and Caribear, which become even more apparent if you play through Kaya's hangout, I am very suspicious of Caribear being used as scaffolding for the Loom of Fate and Kaya being khaenri'ah's last hope. Like, is it not possible that Kaya is also a candidate for Loom of Fate scaffolding? Like a backup plan for if the Caribear loom fails? But if this was the intention, I wonder if Kaya possessing a vision makes him ineligible for the task. Because Renee says that obtaining a vision must be avoided at all costs because it binds you to the fate of the world. And if you were supposed to become a brand new Loom of Fate, free from the previous loom, then being bound to the previous one seems problematic. Well, I suppose it doesn't really matter for right now. This is all just wild speculation on my part. And you know what? That's more or less everything I wanted to share for right now. But while we're thanking all the budding scholars that support this mess of a channel, I have one more observation to share. During the last Ito music event, there was a scene with A and Miko where they talked about a war, specifically the Resistance War on Inazuma. And at the time, I mentioned it was probably foreshadowing for Ragnarok, using Project Stuja as my justification. I'm a bit more confident about this now since we also have the Nithhog Nibelung Vinsterking hypothesis in hand, and the fact that one of the current events as of time of recording is about preparing for war. And if we go a little bit farther back to the last Windbloom, Alice commented on a hypothetical war that could break out between all nations. And that's pretty concerning in context, given that there are visionaries like Nicole sitting at the table with her. What have you seen, Nicole? What do you know? Well, I think we can all agree that war is coming. Natlin is soon. I'm excited, and I hope you are too. So thank you all so much for watching. I'm gonna catch you in the next one, so take care.